At my son's New Year's party, my daughter-in-law raised a toast. She called me the envious old woman who never let go of the past. Everyone laughed. My son said nothing. I simply left in silence. The next day, I revealed a secret I'd hidden for 30 years. He wasn't mine by blood. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The Dawson family's New Year's Eve party glowed with polished perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light across Daniel's grand foyer, where laughter and music mingled with the faint scent of expensive champagne. Relatives filled the space, voices rising in cheerful conversation, children darting between adults clutching their new toys. On the surface, everything gleamed with warmth and celebration. But for Margaret Dawson, the glow dimmed the moment her eyes fell upon the corkboard near the staircase. It was where family announcements, schedules, and lists usually hung, a practical spot in her son's immaculate home. Tonight, it bore the handwritten chart for the annual gift exchange. Names were neatly aligned in columns, festive doodles dancing along the edges. She leaned closer, searching for her place. And then she saw it. Her name had been written not as Margaret Dawson, not as mom or grandma. No, it read, Margaret, the envious old woman. Her breath caught. For years, she had endured the subtle digs, the way conversations trailed off when she entered the room, the invitations that arrived late or not at all. She had told herself not to mind, that family dynamics were complicated, that her presence, though uncelebrated, still mattered. But seeing the words scrawled there, cruel and deliberate, was not something she could brush aside. They struck deeper than whispers ever had. They pierced. Her hand trembled as she unpinned the paper, folded it, and slipped it into her pocket. A lump formed in her throat, heavy and unyielding. Just as she turned away, a small voice tugged at her heart. Grandma, come see what I got for Christmas. Jacob's wide smile glowed with 7-year-old excitement as he pulled at her sleeve. Margaret forced her lips into a smile, stroking his soft hair. In a minute, sweetheart. Grandma needs to fix something first. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Olivia. Radiant as ever, Daniel's wife stood in a shimmering silver dress, laughing among Daniel's colleagues from the law firm. Her laughter was a performance, honey dripping from her tone, her golden hair glinting under the light. But all Margaret could see was cruelty. Daniel stood close, his hand resting possessively at the small of Olivia's back. He smiled faintly at her words, though his gaze never once sought his mother's across the room. Once he had looked at her as though she held the stars in her hands. Now he looked right through her. Margaret approached, waiting until Olivia's conversation faltered. Olivia's smile flickered when she saw her, edges tightening like a mask stretched too thin. Margaret, there you are, Olivia crooned. Everyone's been asking about you. Her voice dripped with honey, yet her eyes glinted cold. Margaret's resolve sharpened. I need a word with you and Daniel, she said evenly, in private. Daniel frowned, clearly reluctant. Mom, we're hosting. Can it wait? No, Margaret answered firmly. It can't. 10 minutes later, the three of them stood inside Daniel's polished home office, the muffled sound of laughter and music pressed against the closed door. Margaret laid the folded paper on the desk. Would either of you like to explain this? Olivia glanced down, then flicked her eyes away with practiced indifference. It's just the gift exchange list. What about it? Read what you wrote next to my name. Daniel picked up the page. His brow furrowed as he read aloud, Margaret, the envious old woman. His jaw tightened. Olivia, did you write this? It was a joke, she said with a careless shrug. A joke? Margaret's voice surprised her with its steadiness, though her chest burned with fury. You humiliated me in front of the entire family. Oh, please, don't be dramatic. No one noticed. I noticed. The words rang out, sharp and final. Daniel dragged a hand through his hair, the gesture so like his father Edward's that Margaret's heart twisted. Mom, I'm sure Olivia didn't mean anything by it. You know how her humor can be. Always defending her. Margaret's voice cracked with hurt. Always taking her side. Did you know she wrote this? Daniel hesitated, and that silence was louder than any confession. You did, Margaret whispered. For God's sake, Margaret, Olivia snapped, her mask slipping. It's New Year's Eve. Must we ruin the night? Something inside Margaret snapped. 30 years of swallowed words, of letting herself be sidelined, of pretending slights didn't matter. It all boiled to the surface. No, Olivia, we're doing this now. Her voice trembled with conviction as she turned to her son. Daniel, I have endured her disrespect for years. I have watched you turn into someone I barely recognize. But this is the line. Mom, do you know what I was doing at your age? Her voice broke as memories rose, vivid and raw. I was working 2 jobs after your father died, skipping meals so you could have school clothes, learning to fix cars because there was no one else. I was loving you more than I loved myself. Olivia rolled her eyes, but Daniel placed a hand on her arm, silencing her. For once, even he looked uncomfortable. Margaret's hand shook as she grabbed her purse from the chair. I won't spend another moment in a family that ridicules me. Mom, wait, Daniel said, his voice suddenly tight. The party isn't over. Where are you going? She straightened, her eyes locking onto his, firm and unflinching. Home. To decide whether I still belong in a family that treats me like this. Shock rippled across his face, guilt flickering, but too late. Margaret walked to the door. Behind her, Olivia's cold voice floated through the air. She'll be back. Where else would she go? But Olivia was wrong. This time, Margaret wasn't coming back as the same woman. A secret she had buried for 3 decades stirred inside her, ready to surface. A truth that would change everything. The streets blurred past Margaret Dawson's windshield as she drove home that night, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Street lamps cast fleeting halos on the wet pavement, their glow warping through the tears that clouded her eyes. She hardly remembered the turns she took, her body moving on instinct while her mind tumbled backward through decades of sacrifice and silence. Her apartment welcomed her with its familiar hush. The space was modest, tidy, shaped by the limitations of what she could afford after helping Daniel with the down payment on his first house. She had told him it came from his college fund, a lie, one of many she had crafted over the years, to protect him, to make his life easier, while hers shrank in quiet ways. Margaret slipped off her coat and set water to boil for tea, her hands trembling against the kettle. Steam soon curled upward, and she wrapped both palms around the mug as though it might steady her. The silence pressed close, thick with memories she had spent years pushing away. Her gaze drifted across the room until it landed on the photo album resting on the shelf, its spine worn, its surface coated in dust. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingertips leaving trails in the gray powder of neglect. The first photo stared back at her, a younger Margaret, just 25, cradling a newborn in her arms. Daniel. Her smile in the picture was tired, stretched thin from nights without sleep, yet her eyes glowed with devotion. She traced the outline of his tiny body on the page, remembering the weight of him in her arms, the way his fragile fingers had curled around hers with unshakable trust. Her phone buzzed against the table, startling her. The message lit the screen. Mom, come back to the party. You're making a scene by leaving. She turned the phone face down without replying, her jaw set. Turning the pages, she fell deeper into the archive of her life. Daniel's first steps captured in a blurry photograph, his wobbling legs reaching for her outstretched arms. His first day of kindergarten, clutching her hands so tightly she thought her fingers might bruise. His high school graduation, where she had worked overtime shifts to buy the watch he had wanted, standing in the crowd with pride swelling through her chest like a rising tide. Every picture told the same story, her endless giving, her ceaseless love, and the steady erasure of her own needs. Edward's absence threaded through those years like a shadow. He had died when Daniel was only 4, leaving her to carry both roles, mother and father. Margaret remembered how she had risen before dawn to clean offices, how she had worked late nights at the hospital, her body aching as she trudged home in worn shoes. She had taught herself to fix leaking pipes, change flat tires, and balance checkbooks with pennies left over. She had done it all for Daniel, for the boy who was the axis of her entire world. She flipped further, reaching the photographs she had always avoided. Daniel's law school graduation. There she stood on the edge of the frame, her smile strange, almost forced, as if she had already begun to sense the widening gulf between them. Then came Olivia. The memory of their first meeting still stung. Margaret had spent hours preparing Daniel's favorite meal, her nerves taut with hope that Olivia would see her as family. Olivia had smiled politely, her eyes scanning the small apartment as though assessing its value. She had picked at her plate, speaking more about Daniel's career than anything personal. Her questions directed at him, while Margaret sat invisible at her own table. Later, Daniel had called to say how much Olivia liked her. He couldn't see the cool calculation in Olivia's gaze, couldn't feel the silent judgment weighing in every word. Over the years, the distance grew. Calls that once came daily dwindled to weekly, then monthly. Sunday dinners turned into occasional visits, then faded almost completely. And when grandchildren arrived, Margaret thought she might find her way back into Daniel's life through Jacob and Emily. Instead, Olivia controlled every moment with velvet-gloved excuses. "They're napping," she would say when Margaret called to visit. "We're busy with activities this weekend." Or, "They've been exposed to something at school. We wouldn't want you to catch it at your age." Always reasonable, always wrapped in a tone of care, but each excuse chipped away at her place in their lives. When she did see the children, Olivia hovered like a shadow, correcting her. "That's outdated, Margaret. We don't do that anymore." Or, "Let me handle it. You just relax." Even the clothing Olivia chose for her seemed designed to diminish her. Shades that drained her face while Olivia herself glowed beside her. Margaret had endured it, swallowing her pride, telling herself it wasn't worth the fight if it meant even a sliver of closeness to Daniel and the children. The whistle of the kettle brought her back to the present, though her tea had already cooled. She set the cup down untouched, her gaze drawn to the last section of the album, the part she never dared linger on. There, tucked at the very back, were photographs that carried the truth she had buried for 30 years. Margaret brushed her fingers against the images, her heart pounding. The face that stared back was not her own. It was Charlotte's, her sister, Daniel's true mother, smiling with an infant in her arms. The resemblance between Daniel and Charlotte had always been undeniable if one dared to look closely. Margaret's throat tightened. She had kept the secret for Edward, had lived with it because he asked her to, because he had promised it was best for everyone. She had carried it like a stone in her chest for decades. Until tonight. Until the words, "envious old woman," tore through the walls she had built to protect herself. Now, sitting alone in her dim apartment, the truth pressed against her like a storm at the door, demanding to be unleashed. Sometimes the cruelest truths wait in silence until one careless act tears them wide open. That night, after decades of swallowing pain and protecting others from the storm inside her, Margaret Dawson felt the ground shift beneath her feet. And storms, once they begin, never stop politely at the doorstep. The knock on her apartment door came just before midnight. She froze, the sound sharp against the hush of her small kitchen. Who could it be at such an hour? She opened the door to find Daniel standing in the hallway, his cheeks flushed from the cold or from anger. She couldn't tell which. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark coat, melting into droplets that streaked the fabric. "Mom," he said tightly, stepping inside without waiting for her invitation. "What were you thinking leaving like that?" "Olivia's upset." The guests were asking questions. Margaret closed the door slowly, her jaw firm. "Olivia is upset? Your wife humiliated me in front of everyone, and your first concern is her feelings?" Daniel dragged a hand through his hair, an old habit inherited from Edward. His eyes avoided hers. "I know it was in poor taste, but it was just a joke. You know how Olivia gets when she's planning parties. She gets carried away." "This wasn't getting carried away," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "It was deliberate cruelty." He shifted uncomfortably, finally meeting her gaze. For a moment she saw her little boy again, the boy who once clung to her hand and looked to her for every answer. But the man in front of her was different, polished, careful, and too quick to defend the woman who had wedged herself between them. "Maybe you're right," he muttered. "I'll talk to her." "Like you've talked to her every other time?" Margaret's words cracked with years of hurt. "When she forgot to invite me to Emily's birthday party. When she told Jacob I was too busy to come to his school play, even though I never knew about it in the first place. How many times have you excused her behavior, Daniel?" His face hardened. "That's not fair." "It's the truth." Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the force of everything she had swallowed. "And you know it." For a moment, silence pressed between them. Daniel checked his watch, as though even now time was slipping away from him, as though she were an interruption instead of his mother. "It's nearly midnight," he said. "I should get back to Olivia and the guests. Can we talk about this tomorrow when things are calmer?" Margaret stared at him, her chest rising and falling with the weight of 30 years. She had raised this man, poured her soul into his life, carried him through storms he never even knew existed. And yet here he stood, dismissing her pain, excusing his wife, treating her as though her suffering was an inconvenience. "Yes," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "Tomorrow, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Relief flickered across his features. "Good. Tomorrow then. I'll come by in the afternoon." He left quickly, the echo of the closing door lingering long after his footsteps faded. Margaret stood motionless in the silence, the hum of the radiator filling the emptiness. Her hands trembled as she sank into the chair at the kitchen table. The storm inside her no longer lay quiet. It roared against her ribs, demanding release. She turned to the shelf where the photo album sat open from earlier, its pages spread like a wound. The photographs of Charlotte, her sister, stared back at her. The truth she had guarded for 30 years burned in her chest. She whispered to the empty room, to the ghost of her sister, to the boy who wasn't really hers. "Tomorrow he'll know. No more lies." Outside, the city carried on with its celebrations. Fireworks erupted in the distance, colors blooming against the midnight sky. Shouts and laughter drifted upward from the streets. But in Margaret's apartment, there was only the hush of inevitability. She poured the untouched tea down the sink, her hands shaking less now, her resolve hardening with every second. For years she had been invisible, the afterthought at her own family's table. Tonight they had called her the envious old woman, as though her sacrifices were nothing more than bitterness disguised as age. But tomorrow the truth would rip through that illusion. Tomorrow Daniel would learn who he really was. The clock ticked past midnight. Margaret sat in the dim light, her body weary, but her spirit alive with a strange, terrible freedom. Once the secret left her lips, there would be no way back. The risk of losing Daniel forever loomed like a shadow, but the weight of silence had already crushed too much of her life. She lifted her chin, staring at the photograph of Charlotte holding a newborn Daniel, her sister's exhausted but radiant face mirroring the boy's features. Margaret's voice broke into the night. "Charlotte, forgive me. Tomorrow he will know you gave him life, and tomorrow he will know that I gave him mine." The kettle whistled again on the stove, shrill and insistent, though she had never turned it back on. She rose to silence it, a shiver coursing through her as though the universe itself had demanded her attention. Tomorrow would bring reckoning. And for anyone listening now, for anyone who has ever carried secrets too heavy to bear, stay with me. What Margaret reveals will shake the very foundation of her family. Morning arrived gray and brittle, pale light seeping through the curtains of Margaret Dawson's apartment. She had not slept. Her body ached from the weight of a decision that had waited 30 years, pressing harder with every breath she drew. Coffee steamed in a mug on the table, untouched, the bitterness curling in the air. Her stomach was too tight to eat. All she could do was wait. At 10 minutes to 2, the doorbell rang. Margaret's hands shook as she smoothed her skirt and opened the door. Daniel stood there, his eyes bloodshot, his face lined with exhaustion. He stepped inside with the polite reserve of a stranger. "No hug," she noted silently. Those had grown rare over the years, but the absence cut sharper today. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, clinging to courtesy as though it might buy her more time. "No, thanks. I can't stay long. Olivia has a charity luncheon, and I promised to watch the kids." Of course. Olivia's schedule always took precedence. They sat in the living room, silence stretching thin between them. Daniel checked his phone twice before Margaret spoke, her voice breaking the stillness. "I need to show you something." She rose and went to her bedroom closet, retrieving a worn cardboard box. Its edges had frayed from years of being moved from place to place, always hidden, never discarded. Margaret carried it carefully, setting it on the coffee table between them. Daniel eyed it warily. "What's this? If this is about Olivia—" "It's not about Olivia," she interrupted, her voice steadier than she expected. "It's about you, about where you come from." Confusion flickered across his face. "I don't understand." With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the box. Inside lay the fragments of a secret life, a birth certificate, hospital records, yellowed letters, photographs that had never seen the light of family albums. She lifted the certificate first and handed it to him. Daniel read slowly, his brow furrowing. This says my mother is Charlotte Harmon. He looked up sharply. Dad's secretary? That can't be right. Not just his secretary, Margaret said softly. She was also my sister. Color drained from Daniel's face. What are you saying? Your father and Charlotte had an affair. When she became pregnant with you, they kept it hidden. Your father begged me not to leave him, and Charlotte, she wasn't ready to be a mother. Daniel shook his head, standing abruptly, pacing the small space as though trying to outrun her words. That's not possible. You're my mother. I have memories of you, of us. I raised you from the time you were 3 months old, she said. Charlotte died in a car accident not long after you were born. Your father confessed everything then. He asked me to raise you as my own. He was terrified that Charlotte's parents would take you away if they knew the truth. Daniel's voice rose, ragged and sharp. Why are you telling me this now? Is this because of Olivia, some kind of revenge? No, Margaret's voice cracked but did not waver. I've wanted to tell you 1,000 times, but your father made me promise to keep it secret. He believed it would only hurt you. I kept that promise until now, but I can't live another day buried under silence. Why now? Daniel demanded. Because 30 years of guilt is too heavy, she whispered. Because every time you thanked me for being a good mother, I felt like an imposter. Because I have lived half my life afraid you would discover the truth on your own and hate me for it. You deserve to know, Daniel. You always did. She gestured toward the box. There are more documents, letters Charlotte wrote to your father, photos of her holding you as a newborn, hospital records, proof. Daniel's hands trembled as he pulled out one of the photographs. Charlotte's face stared back at him, exhausted yet radiant, a baby cradled in her arms. His own eyes mirrored hers. The resemblance was undeniable now that he knew what to look for. My whole life, he whispered, has been a lie. No, Margaret said quickly, reaching for him. Your life has been real. Your childhood, your accomplishments, your family, all of it real. I loved you from the moment your father placed you in my arms. I have always loved you as my own. He stepped back, refusing her touch. Does Olivia know? No one knows but me and your father, before he died. Daniel stuffed the papers and photographs back into the box with shaking hands. I need time. I need to think. I understand, she said, though her heart fractured at the sight of him clutching the box like evidence against her. Why didn't you tell me before? His voice cracked. I had a right to know. Yes, she whispered. You did. But I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid you'd never forgive me. Your father asked me to protect you from the truth and I obeyed. I thought it was love. Maybe it was cowardice. Daniel's face twisted with grief and anger. The man I thought was my father cheated on you with your sister and then asked you to raise his illegitimate child, and you agreed. Edward made terrible mistakes, Margaret admitted, her voice trembling. But he loved you, and so did I. So do I. He moved to the door, the box gripped to his chest. I need to go. Will you call me? She asked, her voice small. When you're ready to talk? He didn't answer. The door clicked, shut behind him, soft but final. Margaret sank onto the couch, her body heavy, her soul hollow. The secret that had lived inside her for 30 years was finally free, but instead of relief, only emptiness remained. She picked up a fallen photograph from the floor, Charlotte holding baby Daniel, and traced her sister's face with a trembling finger. I kept my promise, she whispered to the ghost in the picture. I raised him as my own. I loved him enough for both of us. The shadows lengthened across her apartment, and she wondered if love would ever be enough to mend what had just been broken. Secrets are never silent for long. Once spoken, they ripple outward, touching everyone in their path, and no one remains untouched. Margaret Dawson had carried the truth for 3 decades, but now it lived in Daniel's hands, heavy as a stone, and with it came consequences she could no longer control. 3 days passed in aching quiet. Daniel did not call. Margaret left him a voicemail, then a text, but received nothing in return. She moved through her routine like a ghost, volunteering at the library, attending book club, cooking small meals for one. But her thoughts never left her son. At night, she lay awake, listening to the hum of her radiator, wondering if she had destroyed what little connection remained between them. On Thursday evening, just as she set a modest dinner on the stove, the doorbell rang. Her heart leapt, certain it was Daniel at last. She hurried to the door, hands trembling. But when she opened it, Olivia stood on the threshold, flawless as always. Her blonde hair framed her face in perfect waves, her designer coat tailored to fit like armor. Yet her eyes burned with fury. "What have you done?" Olivia demanded, sweeping inside without waiting for permission. Margaret closed the door slowly, steadying herself. "Hello, Olivia." "Don't you hello me," she snapped, spinning toward her with a sharp scent of expensive perfume. "Daniel has barely spoken since New Year's. He's sleeping in the guest room. He won't tell me what's wrong, but I know it has something to do with you." Margaret moved toward the kitchen, her voice calm. "Would you like some tea?" "I don't want tea. I want answers." Olivia's voice sliced through the air. "What did you tell him? Some lie about me to turn him against me?" Margaret filled the kettle anyway, needing the simple ritual to keep her hands occupied. "I told him the truth about something I've hidden for 30 years. Olivia's expression faltered, her mask slipping for just a moment. "What truth?" "That is for Daniel to share if he chooses, not me." Olivia's eyes narrowed, the fury in them sharp enough to cut. "You spiteful old woman. You couldn't stand that we were happy, could you? You hated that Daniel's life didn't revolve around you anymore." The kettle began to whistle. Margaret turned to silence it, her movements measured. "This has nothing to do with you, though I won't pretend your treatment of me hasn't been painful." "Oh, here we go." Olivia rolled her eyes dramatically. "Poor Margaret, always the victim. It's always about you, isn't it?" Margaret poured hot water over a tea bag, watching the color bleed slowly into the cup. Her voice was quiet but firm. "It rarely is. That's the point." Olivia jabbed a manicured finger toward her. "Do you know what your problem is? You're jealous. You resent that Daniel values my opinion over yours. You hate that I'm the mother of his children, that I'm the center of his world now." Margaret set the spoon down carefully and looked Olivia directly in the eye. "My problem is that you've worked to isolate him from me since the day you met him. My problem is that you limit my access to my grandchildren. My problem is that you treat me as though I'm disposable." Olivia's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Is that what you told him? That I'm some villain keeping you from your son? That's pathetic." "I told him the truth about his birth," Margaret said quietly. "About his biological mother." For the first time, Olivia's composure cracked. Her brows knit together. "What are you talking about? You're his mother." Margaret's voice was steady. "No, I'm his aunt, his father's wife, but not his biological mother." Olivia stared, momentarily speechless. Margaret could almost see the calculations shifting behind her eyes. "You're lying," she whispered at last, but uncertainty laced her words. "I have the documents," Margaret said. "The birth certificate, hospital records, photographs. Daniel has them now." Olivia sank into a chair at the table, her voice quieter. "That's what he's been staring at, locked in his office with that box." Margaret sat opposite her, folding her hands around the warm cup of tea. "I raised him after Charlotte died. No one else knew. Only his father and me." Olivia's mouth twisted. "So this is your revenge. For every little slight, every time you thought I excluded you, you drop a bomb big enough to destroy him. To destroy us." "It wasn't about revenge," Margaret said, though her chest ached with the question she could not silence. Had some part of her wanted to shake Olivia's hold on Daniel? "It was about truth. He had a right to know." Before Olivia could respond, the door opened. Both women turned. Daniel stood there, holding the spare key Margaret had given him years ago. His gaze swept from his wife to his mother, his jaw tight. "What are you doing here?" he asked Olivia. She softened instantly, her voice sliding into a gentleness Margaret had never heard directed her way. "I was worried about you. You've been distant, and I thought maybe Margaret could help me understand." His expression hardened. "So you came here behind my back." He turned toward his mother. "Did you tell her?" Margaret's lips parted, but Olivia answered first. "About your birth mother?" "Yes." Daniel's jaw clenched. "That wasn't her story to tell." But it wasn't her story to bury for 30 years either. His voice rose, raw with anger. Everyone has been lying to me. My whole life has been built on lies. He looked at his wife. And you, how long have you been keeping me from her? I saw your texts to your sister, laughing about the mother-in-law problem, bragging about excluding her from family events. Color drained from Olivia's face. Daniel, those were jokes, just venting. You know how she can be. No, he said coldly. What I know is that I've been blind for too long. He turned to Margaret. I need more time. I'm not ready to ask questions yet. Then to Olivia, all my love of you. Don't come home tonight. I need space. The silence that followed was louder than fireworks. And if you're listening now, stay with me. Because this storm has only begun, and the next revelation will test the very limits of family. The days that followed were some of the loneliest of Margaret Dawson's life. Daniel retreated into silence, leaving her adrift in an ocean of uncertainty. Each morning she checked her phone before her eyes had even adjusted to the light, praying for a message, a missed call, some sign of his voice reaching back to her. Nothing came. She tried to fill her hours. On Tuesday, she volunteered at the library, straightening shelves no one had touched in weeks. On Wednesday, she attended book club, listening without hearing, as her friends debated plots and characters. She smiled where appropriate, but her mind was elsewhere, anchored to the box of documents she had handed to her son and to the silence that had swallowed him since. Had she made a terrible mistake? Would it have been kinder to carry the secret to her grave, as Edward had wanted? The questions circled her endlessly, gnawing at her whenever the apartment grew too quiet. On Thursday evening, as she prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread, the doorbell rang. Her pulse leapt. She wiped her hands quickly on a towel and opened the door. Daniel stood in the hall, soaked from a February rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping onto her welcome mat. His expression was unreadable. "May I come in?" he asked, his tone formal, as though he were speaking to a stranger. "Of course," Margaret said, stepping aside. Her heart raced as she fetched a towel, pressing it into his cold hands. "Thanks," he murmured, patting his face dry before lowering the towel to his lap. He did not sit, only stood in the center of her living room, looking around as though seeing it for the first time. "I've been doing some research," he said without preamble. "I found some of Charlotte's old friends. They confirmed your story." Margaret nodded, unable to find her voice. "I also found her parents," Daniel continued, his words heavy. "They're alive, living in Arizona, my grandparents." "The Harmons," she said softly, the name stirring memories she had buried long ago. "Did you speak to them?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." She gestured toward the couch. "Please sit. Would you like tea or something stronger?" "Tea is fine." His lips curved faintly, almost a smile. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, grateful for the moment to compose herself. The whistle of the kettle steadied her hands as she poured steaming water into 2 mugs. She carried them back into the living room, where Daniel now stood before a framed photograph of himself at 8 years old. He wore a Little League uniform, gap-toothed and grinning. "I remember this day," he said. "I struck out 3 times. Missed an easy catch. I was miserable on the ride home." Margaret's chest softened with the memory. "You were convinced you had let everyone down. I took you for ice cream, told you baseball was just a game, but character was forever. And then you made me list 3 things I had done well that day, even if they weren't about baseball. You said you had been a good sport. You encouraged your teammates, and you remembered to thank the coach even though you were disappointed." Daniel set the photo down carefully. "That was real. That moment. You being my mother." "Yes," she said, "it was." He accepted the mug of tea and sank onto the couch, looking more worn than a man in his 30s should. His voice was quiet when he spoke again. "Olivia and I are separating." Margaret's breath caught. She had expected conflict, but not this. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Are you? I'm not sure I am. Things haven't been right for a long time. I just didn't want to see it." He stared into the tea as though it might offer answers. "After I found out about my birth, I started questioning everything, including how Olivia treats you. I saw the texts. I remembered all the times she forgot to invite you or claimed you were too busy. I heard the way she spoke about you when you weren't there, and I realized how blind I've been." Margaret stayed silent, letting him unspool the knots of his thoughts. "She always had excuses," Daniel went on, "and I believed them because it was easier than facing the truth, that she wanted to cut you out, that I let her." "Daniel, no, let me finish." He set the mug down firmly, leaning forward. "I've thought a lot about you, about Charlotte, about the choices you all made, and what you did, raising me after what they did to you. That was extraordinary. I'm not sure I could have done the same." Tears sprang hot and sudden to Margaret's eyes. "You were just a baby. None of it was your fault. And none of it was yours either," Daniel said, his voice stronger now. "But you still carried it. You gave up your chance to have more children because Dad didn't want them. You worked 2 jobs, sacrificed your career, everything for a child who wasn't even yours by blood. You are my mother in every way that matters." Margaret's throat closed around her words. "I managed," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. Daniel's gaze softened, though his jaw was still tight. "I'm still angry at Dad for betraying you, at Charlotte for leaving you to raise me alone, even though I know her death wasn't her choice, at you for not telling me sooner." "You have every right," Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. "But I'm also grateful," he said, "for the life you gave me, for the love you showed me, even when I didn't deserve it." Her tears spilled freely then, and she didn't try to hide them. "You always deserved it. Always." Daniel reached across the small space and took her hand. It was the first time in weeks he had touched her, and she clung to it as though it were a rope pulling her from deep water. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted. "With Olivia, with us, with any of it. But I do know this, I don't want to lose you again." "You won't," she promised, her voice fierce despite her tears. "I'm right here." Rain tapped against the windows as they sat together, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of possibility. It was not a perfect reconciliation. Too much had happened for that, but it was a beginning. Forgiveness is not a sudden burst of light. It is a slow, painful dawn, creeping into the cracks of grief and betrayal. For Margaret Dawson, every word her son spoke carried both a sting and a balm, reminding her that love and anger can live side by side in the same fragile heart. Daniel sat across from her, shoulders slumped, tea cooling untouched in his hands. His voice was unsteady, but his words cut with the sharpness of truth. "I've been blind, Mom. Blind to Olivia, blind to how she's treated you, blind to how I let it happen." The word Mom rang through her like a bell. It had been weeks since he called her that, and though the air between them was still heavy, it was enough to make her chest ache with relief. "I don't blame you for being angry," she said softly. "You needed to know the truth. I just never knew how to tell you without breaking us apart." Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet as if searching for answers hidden in the fibers. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive Dad, or Charlotte. Maybe not even you. But I also know I can't erase what you've done for me. Every memory I have, every lesson, every sacrifice, it's you, no one else." Margaret reached out, placing her hand over his. His fingers trembled, but didn't pull away. "You don't have to forgive me today. You don't have to forgive me ever. Just know that I loved you every day as though you were my own blood, and nothing, no document, no secret will ever change that." Daniel's eyes lifted to hers, shadowed with exhaustion, but softened by something fragile. Trust maybe, or the beginning of it. "I've filed for separation from Olivia." Margaret's breath caught. She studied his face, searching for hesitation, but there was none, only quiet resignation. "She manipulated me for years," Daniel continued. "I let her. I wanted to believe her explanations because believing meant I didn't have to confront the truth. But after everything you told me, after everything I discovered on my own, I can't pretend anymore." Margaret swallowed hard, torn between sorrow for his pain and a guilty spark of relief. "I never wanted your marriage to end." He gave a humorless laugh. "It wasn't just about you, Mom. There were cracks long before this. I just ignored them." His voice grew quieter. "She kept me from you, from the kid's grandmother, and I let her run there. That's on me." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes, but she held them back. What matters is that you see it now, and that you know you were never unloved. Daniel's jaw tightened, grief flaring in his gaze. I'm still furious with Dad, furious with Charlotte, even though I know her death wasn't her fault. Furious with you for waiting so long. But I can't deny what you gave me. You raised me, Mom. You're the only reason I am who I am. Margaret's tears finally slipped free, running hot down her cheeks. She squeezed his hand. You always deserved every ounce of love I gave you. Always. He nodded, and for the first time in weeks, the silence between them wasn't sharp. It was tender, tentative, alive with possibility. Later that night after Daniel left, Margaret sat alone in her apartment. The rain had stopped, but drops still slid down the glass, catching the faint glow of streetlights. She touched the photograph of Charlotte that rested on her table, her sister's young face frozen in time. I did my best, she whispered into the quiet. He's grown, he's strong. He knows the truth now, and he still calls me Mom. The following days passed with a fragile sense of peace. Daniel's visits became more frequent. He didn't stay long, an hour here, a short conversation there, but it was enough. Each time he came, he seemed less burdened by silence, more willing to share pieces of his heart. One evening, he brought Jacob and Emily. The children rushed into Margaret's arms, their laughter filling the apartment with light she hadn't felt in months. Emily's solemn eyes searched her face. Daddy says we'll see you more now. Is that true? Margaret kissed the girl's forehead, her throat tightening. Yes, sweetheart, as much as you want. Jacob clung to her waist, his small voice muffled against her sweater. I missed you, Grandma. Her arms tightened around them both, her tears falling freely now. I missed you too, more than you know. For the first time in years, Margaret felt whole again, and yet she knew the storm was far from over. There would be more questions, more reckonings. Meeting the Harmons loomed ahead, a reminder that the past still reached forward, demanding to be faced. But for now, in the circle of her grandchildren's laughter and her son's cautious presence, Margaret allowed herself a rare gift: hope. And to you listening now, remember this. Families can fracture under secrets, but they can also heal in ways you never imagined. Stay with me, because what lies ahead will test not only Margaret's strength, but Daniel's capacity to redefine the meaning of family itself. A year later, Margaret Dawson's kitchen brimmed with warmth and sound. The smell of sugar and butter drifted through the air as she arranged cookies on a platter, the laughter of her grandchildren carrying from the living room. Sunlight spilled across the table where Emily sat, her small fingers busy with paper, glue, and glitter. Do you think Daddy will like his birthday card? Emily asked, her dark eyes bright with concentration as she held up her creation. Margaret smiled, her chest swelling with a tender pride. He'll love it, sweetheart, especially that drawing of all of you together. Emily pointed to the corner of the card where she had carefully glued a glittering stick figure family. That's me and Jacob and Daddy, and that's you, Grandma, and Oscar. Margaret chuckled at the little dog's crooked glitter ears. And who's this? She asked, nodding toward another figure drawn with a crown of long brown hair. That's Miss Jasmine, Emily said matter-of-factly. She's nice. She lets me help when she cooks, even if I make a mess. Margaret's smile softened. Jasmine Turner had stepped into Daniel's life 6 months earlier, and from the start she had been different. Warm, attentive. She asked Margaret about her day and actually listened to the answers. She never seemed threatened by her presence, never angled to push her aside. Jasmine carried herself with an ease that soothed everyone around her, and Margaret could see the change in Daniel when he was with Aunt Per, the quiet relief, the lightness he hadn't shown in years. Margaret placed the last cookie on the platter and glanced toward the living room. Daniel and Jacob were bent over a board game, their laughter mingling in a sound so familiar it nearly brought her to tears. For years, she had wondered if moments like this would ever return to her life, if she would ever be welcome in her son's home again. Now here she was, surrounded by family, woven back into the fabric she had once been cut from. Life had shifted in ways she never imagined. After months of separation, Daniel and Olivia's divorce was finalized. The process had been bitter, with Olivia lashing out and fighting for control, but eventually, custody of the children was settled. Daniel now had Jacob and Emily half the time, And though they spent summers with Olivia in Chicago, they spent school years close to Margaret. Daniel had sold the large, pristine house he once shared with Olivia and bought a smaller one nearby. The roof needed patching, the backyard was little more than a patch of grass, but it felt real, lived in, warm. It felt like a home. For Margaret, too, life had opened in new ways. No longer just the tolerated mother-in-law or the background figure at holidays, she was now fully herself. She was grandma. She was mom. She was Margaret, a woman with value beyond sacrifice. She had even begun to step into a new season of her own. At the library where she volunteered, she met Paul Whitman, a widower with kind eyes and a gentle laugh. Their conversations began over books, grew into coffee dates, and slowly blossomed into something more. She had been hesitant at first, uncertain if her heart had room after so many years of quiet loneliness. But Daniel's surprised smile when she told him had eased her fears. "You deserve to be happy, Mom," he had said simply. Those words had lingered with her, warming her more than she expected. "Grandma, can I lick the spoon?" Jacob dashed into the kitchen, his eyes wide with mischief as he pointed to the bowl of chocolate frosting. Margaret laughed, handing it to him with a wink. "Of course, that's the chef's privilege." He darted out again, chocolate already smudging his chin. Margaret shook her head with fond exasperation, then turned as Daniel appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching her with a smile that carried both affection and quiet gratitude. "Need any help in here?" he asked. "We're almost finished," Margaret said, smoothing frosting across the cake. "Just trying to keep Jacob from devouring it before the candles go on." Daniel stepped closer, swiping a finger along the edge of the bowl before she could stop him. "Hey," she laughed, batting his hand away. "You're worse than the kids." His grin softened, and when he spoke again, his voice was serious. "Mom, there's something I've been meaning to tell you." Margaret froze, her heart stuttering at the weight in his tone. Even after a year of healing, fear flickered inside her whenever his voice carried that edge of gravity. "I contacted the Harmons," Daniel said quietly. "Charlotte's parents, my other grandparents." The frosting spatula slipped slightly in her hand. She set it down carefully, her breath catching. "I see. How did it go?" "Better than I expected," Daniel said. His expression eased as though recalling the conversation soothed him. "They're in their 80s now, but still sharp. They told me stories about Charlotte, what she was like as a child, her favorite books, how she loved photography. They showed me some of her pictures. She was talented." "She always had a camera," Margaret whispered, her throat tight. Memories of her sister stirred, bittersweet. "She had an eye for beauty." Daniel nodded. "They asked about you. They remembered you from gatherings years ago. They wanted to know if you were still in my life." Margaret's hands curled against the counter. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them the truth," Daniel said firmly. He reached across the counter, covering her hand with his. "That you've been my mother in every way that matters. That you gave up everything to raise me. That I couldn't have asked for a better mom." Tears welled instantly in her eyes. "You said that?" "I did," he said, squeezing her hand. "And I meant it. But that's not all. They want to meet you. They said they've always been grateful to you for giving me a life Charlotte couldn't. They thought Dad wanted a clean break, that you didn't want them involved. But that wasn't true. It was just another of his lies." Margaret's heart pounded, fear and relief crashing together. Meeting the Harmons, Charlotte's parents, the family tied to her deepest wound, had once terrified her. But now, with Daniel's hand warm over hers, she felt something unexpected. "I think I'd like that," she said at last. "They're part of you, and that means they're part of me." Daniel's smile was soft, filled with quiet pride. "I hoped you'd say that." From the living room came Jacob's impatient voice. "Dad, Grandma, are we playing or what?" Daniel chuckled, calling back, "Coming." He looked at her again, eyes warm. "Ready?" Margaret glanced around her kitchen, the half-frosted cake, Emily humming as she worked at the table, Daniel's steady presence beside her. For the first time in decades, her life was not defined by secrets or shadows, but by light. "More than ready," she said. The Harmon's house in Arizona stood low and wide beneath the desert sky, its white stucco walls glowing faintly in the afternoon sun. Margaret Dawson stepped from the rental car, her knees trembling, though her grip on Daniel's arm was steady. Every step toward the front door felt like a step into a past she had both fled and carried for 3 decades. Daniel rang the bell. The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly couple. Robert Harmon was stooped but sharp-eyed, his white hair cropped close. Beside him, his wife Elaine, thin and dignified, clutched the edge of the door as though steadying herself against the sight of the woman who had raised her grandson. "Daniel," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion, "and you must be Margaret." Margaret's throat tightened, but she managed a nod. "Yes, thank you for welcoming me." Elaine stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "For years we thought we'd lost not only Charlotte, but you too. We were told you wanted nothing to do with us. But that was never true, was it?" "No," Margaret whispered. "It was not my choice. Edward thought distance was safer. I carried his secret, but I never stopped thinking of you." They ushered her inside. The living room was filled with photographs. Charlotte at different ages, her smile luminous, her eyes so like Daniel's that Margaret's heart twisted. She reached for a framed picture on the mantel, Charlotte holding a camera, the desert light golden around her. She loved photography since Elaine said softly, joining her. She saw beauty in everything, even in things others overlooked. Margaret swallowed hard. "I see her in Daniel every day." They sat together, the air thick with memory and the unspoken grief of decades. Daniel guided the conversation gently, asking his grandparents about Charlotte's childhood, her dreams, her favorite books. They shared stories Margaret had never heard, how Charlotte once climbed onto the school roof to capture a perfect sunset, how she read poetry late into the night, how she always wanted to travel to Europe, but never made it. Margaret listened, her chest heavy with sorrow for what had been lost, but also lighter somehow. For the first time, Charlotte was more than a shadow in her life. She was vivid, alive in memory, and Margaret felt the strange comfort of knowing she no longer had to hold her sister's absence alone. Later, as the desert evening deepened, Robert cleared his throat. "Margaret, I know the burden you carried was heavy. Raising Daniel after everything, most would not have done it. We want you to know we are grateful, deeply grateful." Tears blurred Margaret's vision. "I did what I thought was right, but it was love, not duty. He was my son in every way that mattered." Elaine reached across the table, clasping Margaret's hand. "And he always will be. Nothing can undo that, so." When the visit ended, they embraced at the doorway. Margaret felt the weight of years lift as Elaine whispered, "You are family. You always were." On the flight home, Daniel leaned back in his seat, his voice low but certain. "I've been thinking about something, about how lies nearly destroyed us, but the truth gave us a chance to begin again." Margaret turned to him, her heart steady for the first time in years. "Yes, the truth set us free, painfully, but free." Back home, the days folded into a new rhythm. Daniel's divorce finalized without bitterness, and though Olivia remained a presence for the children, the venom between them had faded into distance. Jasmine became more than a companion. She became a gentle presence in the children's lives, someone who welcomed Margaret's role without fear or competition. One spring afternoon, the family gathered at Daniel's house. The backyard smelled of grilled food, the laughter of Jacob and Emily rising above the hum of neighbors mowing lawns. Jasmine sat beside Margaret on the porch, handing her a glass of lemonade. "They adore you, you know," Jasmine said, nodding toward the children. Margaret's eyes softened as she watched them chase each other across the yard. "And I adore them. They're the light of my life." Daniel approached, his smile easy. He carried a plate piled high with food, setting it down on the table before them. "Don't let her fool you," he teased Jasmine. "She's the reason those kids know how to make cookies better than I ever could." Margaret laughed, her chest swelling with the joy she had once thought lost to her forever. For the first time, her family felt whole. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole. That night, after everyone left and the house was quiet, Margaret sat by her window. The city lights glimmered in the distance, steady and bright. She thought of Charlotte, of Edward, of the secrets that had nearly destroyed her. And she thought of Daniel, Jacob, Emily, and the new life that had grown out of truth. She whispered into the stillness, as though her sister might hear her across time and space. "He knows now, and he's strong, and I am finally free." For Margaret Dawson, the circle had closed. Pain had given way to healing, lies to truth, loss to love. The story was not one of perfect endings, but of survival, resilience, and the quiet power of forgiveness. And if you have stayed with this story, let it remind you, secrets can wound, but truth can heal. Families may break, but they can also begin again, stronger than before. So if you carry a burden too heavy to bear alone, speak it, share it. Because in the telling, there is freedom. In the truth, there is life.